talk a little bit about the argument in the motivation chapter. So, there is a contemporary narrative on motivation that basically says students' perceptions affect their motivation. So, the types of motivation one might express has to do with their perceptions, has to do with students' perceptions, attitudes, beliefs. And if you could just get them to have certain attitudes, certain beliefs, certain perceptions, students will be students will express the type of motivation you'd want. And this is the narrative, right? So the narrative is that students' perceptions, attitudes, beliefs are the source of their motivation. And if you want them to be motivated in certain ways, you have to target their perceptions, attitudes, and beliefs. And there are several concepts that are connected with perceptions, attitude, and beliefs, like self-efficacy, learned helplessness, growth mindset, um, attribution theory with locus of control, right? All these different concepts speak to different perceptual variables that affect students' motivation. And so it's important to understand what those perceptual variables are. And the reading for this week, Ormrod does a good job with, I think, explaining those variables and giving strategies and suggestions on how people can go about changing those. So again, the Ormrod reflects a traditional ed psych perspective or ed psych approach, saying, "Hey, this is declarative, right? This is how motivation works, right? These are the variables that affect it. This is how you can go about teaching it, right? So that's right. So that reflects the conventional ed psych perspective. My reading for this week, I review those perceptual in my chapter. I review those perceptual variables, but in the latter part of that chapter, I look at some of the critical concerns with that narrative. And so one of those, and so I'll speak to a couple of them. So one of those critical concerns are, so again, if we think about the distinction between ed psych and critical ed psych, it's about function. And we could speak to the example about Freire again. So motivation, right? So if someone is quote unquote unmotivated, well, first let me talk about that categorization. When we talk about function, the motivation literature, or this idea of motivation, it functions to lead us to call students unmotivated or motivated. So you have students in your classroom, right? So students might be displaying different types of engagement, different types of behaviors, right? Students are doing different things, and the idea is if students are not doing what you want them to do, when you want them to do it, and how you want them to do it, right? They could be categorized or classified as unmotivated. And if students are doing what you want them to do, when you want them to do it, and how you want them to do it, then they could be classified as motivated. Right, and so now, with the idea of motivation, the concept of motivation, what it does, it functions to categorize people as having, right, this internal energy, right, that's facilitating some type of action. People have it or they don't. And then, right, again, going back to function, the function then is people are unmotivated. How do we get them to be motivated, right? Right, again, it's a deficit-based claim. Someone's motivated, someone's unmotivated. Who needs an intervention, right? The unmotivated person needs an intervention, and that's where these perceptual variables come in, right? Well, if they're not motivated, it's maybe they have a low self-efficacy. Maybe they have learned helplessness. Maybe they have all the wrong attributions. Maybe they have a fixed mindset, right? One might go through all these different possibilities and try to use students' behavior, students' utterances, what they say, right, to then conclude, this student, right, it's the student's problem is this perceptual variable. Or anxiety is nil. Maybe the student perceives the context as being threatening, right? So if someone is quote unquote unmotivated, right? What the motivation narrative does, it does encourages us to look at these list of possible perceptual variables for why that child is unmotivated. So this is what the and so the this is the psych narrative. This is what it does, right? And so some folks might say, well, hey, this is not a problem, right? Yeah, sure. This is good, right? We have to figure out who's motivated, who's unmotivated, and how to fix it. Well, there are some concerns, right? And so one concern is, so if students aren't doing what you want them to do when you want them to do it, how you want them to do it, there could be other reasons. One, a teacher doesn't have to conclude that that student's unmotivated, right? There's lots of other factors that might shape that type of engagement. Like some people might resist schooling because in ways that going back to like that critical perspective, that Freirian perspective, right? If schooling is an oppressive institution, if it can be discriminatory, if it can silence voices, if it can marginalize, right? Some students might display resistance to it, right? They may not be engaged, right? And they may not be able to articulate that resistance as political resistance, right? They may not know why they're disengaged, why they're not doing the work, right? They might know it, but their disengagement might be a consequence of a response to potential dehumanizing, oppressive practices and structures in schooling. But what the motivation literature encourages us to do is not to account for that, not to look for that, right? The motivation literature says, no, it's because you're seeing yourself the wrong way. It's because you're seeing the context the wrong way. It's because you're attributing your success and failure to the wrong things. Um, it's because you're not arguably gritty enough, right? You're not seeing learning as a process that takes time, right? That maybe grows slowly over time, right? There could be these other all these perceptual explanate like these explanations for these perceptual problems, right? And the contemporary psych narrative, right, points attention to individuals as being the source and site of motivation problems, right? Not the educational context, not the situation. So that's like one. So right, that's a critical sort of approach to it. Saying, hey, right. Well, one, I think the critical approach would say, look, we don't have to categorize people as motivated or unmotivated, right? We don't have to. Um, but the what and but another consequence is if once we categorize people as unmotivated, and we rely on this narrative, we might ignore those structural inequalities, this type, practices of dehumanization, right? We might not be attuned to those factors or variables in trying to understand students' engagement. Instead, again, we're going down those lists of perceptual variables. Students are the source and site of motivation problems, and we need to fix them if they're motivation problems. All right, so that's a critique of the function of motivation, of the motivation narrative, right? And another critique could be again, it's well, we want to shape people's perception. We want to shape them. Going back to Freire, we want to shape students. We want to shape their perceptual variables so they can adapt to the schooling context, right? Not right. We're not trying to change and negotiate school and context, right? We want students to change themselves, change their beliefs, change their attitudes, change their attributions so that they will be more likely to be motivated in certain ways in that context, right? So the idea is change people so they can function well within that context. And Freire, I think would be highly critical of that because he would always say that schooling is all about trying to for people to negotiate and renegotiate structures and conditions and they should have a voice and help them to reproduce and produce new structures and conditions in ways to mitigate injustice and ways to affirm humanity. Um, but in again in the narrative, the Etzek narrative, right? There's really not that space for that. So another another critical concern with the motivation literature has to do with just the idea of perception of control, right? So part of the Etzite narrative is that if students have the perception of control, they're more likely to be intrinsically motivated, right? And so really this idea of control is very important, right? Again, you want people to have this perception of control, and that's really what matters, right? It doesn't matter if they actually have control, they just need to believe they have control, right? But this idea of control itself, though, is really complicated, right? Because I mean, it goes back to like really I'd say deep philosophical questions about control. How much control do we have, right? But part of the psych narrative, it's not about trying to unpack the complexities of control or highlight those complexities of control. What does it mean to control? How much control can we have? How much control should we have, or whatever, right? Is it even possible to have control? Like these are really important philosophical questions and really enduring philosophical questions, right? But in the psych narrative, those are all sort of just they're not even entertained. It's hey, you got to get people believe that they have control, right? And control maybe looks like X, Y, Z, right? And if you get them to believe they have control, then they're going to be motivated, and it absolutely can work. 100%, right? If people believe they have control, right, they can be motivated. So I wouldn't say that this motivation, like these principles, don't work, that they can't apply. They can, right? It can work if you get folks to believe they have control, right? They are more likely to be motivated in the ways you may want them to be motivated, right? But then you could also ask broader ethical and philosophical questions about whether or not they really have control, and really what does it mean to have control, right? And that's where the critical, right? That's the critical perspective. Critical perspective would start to ask questions about control. What does it mean to control? Again, do we have control? All those philosophical and ethical questions about control. So there's a lot of complexities in the motivation narrative that aren't considered, right? When you read the Ormrod chapter, again, it's more declarative. These are the variables that affect motivation. These are the things you can do in the classroom to affect those variables. But there's a lot of complexities around that particular narrative that should be considered when thinking about motivating students.